alcoholemia and you're going to become an alcoholic or to be a criminal, but obviously there is concern if you see someone drinking very heavily that they early on for some period of time that they might be more likely, given other environmental factors, you said that the association is more likely to have this problem.
I don't know if I heard this wrong. You said that before you drink, that your late teens affects you, how you drink when you grow up.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, it can basically, the way that you drink can have an effect up until age 30. So there's a definite correlation between how much you're drinking in your adolescence and how much you're drinking later on. That doesn't necessarily mean addiction. A lot of things have to come into play to make that happen, but it's definitely somewhat. Most of the twin studies that when the twins were separated, that's pretty much how they figured out that it's about 50% biological, because those twins were both likely to inherit alcoholism, but it was strongly rooted in cultural and environmental factors also. So it's about a 50-50 discrepancy between whether or not you'll inherit it. Yeah, for both twins.
Remember how we talked about twin studies before? These are sort of the gold standard of being able to figure out. Yes. I would say these are probably identical twin studies, so that way you can really figure out how much was from their genetic inheritance and how much from the environment. So what the result of those types of studies with alcoholism suggests, as they said, that about 50% of what helps you, what triggers you to become an alcoholic is from genes and 50% from environmental factors. Thinking about, well, what genetic factors would make you more susceptible to alcoholism? I think this group did mention, like you said, maybe some people get greater amounts of dopamine release from alcohol. In other words, alcohol is more rewarding in terms of the addiction reward circuitry. And so then if that's the case, it's more likely that you might become an alcoholic. Similarly, if you have inherited greater tolerance for alcohol, you drink more and then you can become, you're much more likely to become an alcoholic. So both types of patterns might exist. Thanks very much again. All right, so I want to call up our last group who will go into much more detail about socioeconomic status that that last group just mentioned briefly. I strongly encourage the mic, but it's up to you. It's on.
Okay, we did our research on socioeconomic status and gender related to alcohol use and abuse. Alcohol abuse is characterized by continuous heavy use of alcohol for a specific period of time. The continuing abuse of alcohol can lead to alcohol dependence, otherwise known as alcoholism. Those who suffer from alcoholism are mentally and physically addicted to alcohol, have strong cravings, and feel as though they need it to get by. Alcohol use and abuse is higher among males than females, and 7.7% of persons aged 12 or older, which is an estimated 18.7 million annually, were dependent on alcohol or abused alcohol in the past year. And males are twice as likely as females to have met the criteria for alcohol dependence or abuse.
Okay, so overall, men usually spend more time drinking, consume more alcohol, and cause more problems when compared to women. This is pretty consistent over all demographic groups. There are a few exceptions though. This is thought that maybe because men are more cope with stress with more externalizing ways like alcohol abuse, whereas women actually internalize and just are more likely to get diagnosed with things such as like depression. Men are more likely to take risks when they're drinking, such as not wearing a seatbelt, and are more likely to result in an injury or death. And men are more likely to partake in social activities that involve drinking, such as gambling, watching athletic events, or happy hour. So as related to SES and alcohol abuse, there's a higher prevalence of light or moderate drinking is found in higher economic status in both sexes. And this is maybe thought because that they're more likely to have moderate drinking and high SES because they're more educated and they know the consequences of heavy drinking.
So going off of that, men and women, their psychological dependence on alcohol is more prevalent in those with lower socioeconomic status. for men, alcohol-related health problems are more prevalent also in those of the lower SES. But in comparison, for women, actually drunkenness and hangovers are more prevalent in those of higher SES groups. Those of lower SES, they have a strong link to depressive symptoms and heavy drinking, which could be due to a lack of resources and coping mechanisms when under stress. They could also be potentially living in poverty and may have, financial burdens and health burdens. They may not even be able to go see a doctor for medication, so their coping mechanism might be to abuse alcohol. Those of lower SES are also working more hazardous jobs and longer hours, and therefore are more likely to binge. When compared to those of a higher socioeconomic status, they drink more frequently in moderation, and they may know that this is associated with good health benefits. And lastly, they may also have lower education levels in lower SES, so they may not actually know the risks of drinking large amounts of alcohol.
So most of the research that has been done hasn't included the different racial groups and the minorities. This also has not accounted for the variability in cultural differences, which we touched on earlier, such as Russian or Irish heritage. On average, though, minorities of lower SES face a condition where they undergo rapid culture change, and this does result in self-destructive behavior, such as stress, psychological disorders, and alcohol abuse. The alcohol abuse may be more of a result of living in stressful conditions with a lack of resources, though. And we also want to note that there could be an artificially positive relationship with income. There's an artificially positive relationship between alcohol abuse and income due to the necessity for access to a vehicle to be diagnosed. So you might need a car to go to your doctor, or you might even need health care insurance, which people with lower SES may not have. Also, people who live in more rural areas are more likely than those that live in urban areas to be diagnosed for primary alcohol abuse. So we think that ties in. So there definitely seems to be an interesting paradox that higher SES individuals on average have more access to alcohol because they can't afford it and they do have the cars, but abuse it less, whereas lower SES individuals on average have less alcohol accessibility due to price, but they do abuse it more.
So we have 4 take-home points. The first one is
You know what? I'm sorry. I'm gonna cut you off because we're just about close on time, and you won't be penalized for this. But I want to recap for the class what I most want them to know, because we're so close on time, and that's my fault for talking so much in the beginning. Thank you all very much. So I have their take-home points, but here's the thing. I mean, they said a lot of stuff that's obviously relevant and interesting, but there's really 2 big things I want to make sure you know about SES and alcohol, right? And this is stuff that they've mentioned, but just to highlight this. First of all, not so much related to gender, but just the fact that there is a very strong tendency for people who have more money and more education they're drinking more often. They are more likely to be drinkers, but they are less likely to drink very heavily, and they're less likely to be diagnosed with alcoholism. So that's an unusual finding in the health literature, because here you have something that seems problematic, drinking more, but it's actually linked to people with higher SES. But there is that really important differentiation in that pattern. And this group gave some ideas as to why we might see that kind of pattern we could potentially come back to. But I think actually the other really important thing, and it's related to some of the specific points they made, that actually the earlier group made as well, is that there is sort of more of a stigma against drinking in low SES groups for women specifically. So as you get groups of people who have more education about alcohol or have higher status jobs, that kind of thing, have more money in general, you do see women feeling sort of equal to men and being able to drink as much. But again, they're doing so in a much more light to moderate way. Whereas women who are sort of in more rural areas or areas where there's greater poverty, there actually is a greater stigma against them drinking than there is with men. And so that can lead to some of those interesting differences, specific differences that this group mentioned. I'll try to do some additional recap on that when we get back on Thursday. We're going to be also talking about nicotine on Thursday, which is a really, really interesting gender difference in
So we'll leave it there, and thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.
Damn, low battery. This thing has never.